And dear people, I want you to know how thankful and how honored I am by receiving this degree. One thing I might remark, as I got this doctoral degree without taking any of its classes, it's a procedure I recommend to everyone. But I am very grateful and very honored to have received it, and I bless all those who in any way were responsible for this award for me. As you have already heard, and many of you knew before, I will be retiring in a few weeks, officially. And there's nothing like retirement to make you reflect a little bit on your own life. And in particular, I'm reflecting on my life in psychology. I really began my, shall we say, trip, narrative, or story in psychology, believe it or not, almost 70 years ago. That was 1953 when I was a freshman at the University of Michigan and began shortly after being there as a psychology major. Look at what has happened to psychology since then. I want to go over it with you so you can see, believe it or not, psychology has greatly improved. When I was there were only two approaches to psychology: psychoanalysis, which wasn't very present in the university, and behaviorism. I did, like everyone else, run a couple of rat experiments, and if I did work in personality, it was always to use a scale of some kind to measure the response of a particular person that was predicted. So it was behaviorism and psychoanalysis. When I went to graduate school starting in 1957, between 57 and 62 when I got my degree, another, or shall we say, as they say, third force came online, and that was humanistic psychology. So psychology had expanded a little bit to a larger understanding of the person, now focused on the self, and particularly through people like Carl Rogers, on self-actualization. There was also some growth in the study of brain and behavior, but that was outside of the normal field of psychology in terms of its impact on psychotherapy. Now, after about 1970, a lot of new changes came in. And I want to go over them to show you how in each one of them, what has happened is that the nature of the person has been expanded. Because each of these new schools found an important property of the human person that had been neglected. Shortly after the humanistic psychologists came cognitive and behavioral psychology. What do you know? They had discovered mostly the conscious mind after all the neglect from psychoanalysis. And they discovered reason. So there was reason to help us overcome some of our mental problems, which came strictly from having stupid thoughts. Well, excuse me, irrational and harmful thoughts. Like, all or nothing, or that I'm terrible, and, overgeneralizations and things like that. Well, after cognitive and behavioral psychology came online, it wasn't long before other kinds of psychology also came on. We had family therapy come on that suggests that the person is not just an isolated autonomous being. We're part of a family, so family therapy came. After family therapy, or perhaps about the same time, came interpersonal psychology. Wow, they've discovered that other people are important in our life. So you see, it's expanded it from just the unconscious and supposed irrational sexual and aggressive desires. We're now talking about much more of the whole person. But it continued. They then developed emotion-focused therapy, where they realized that we had to get in touch with people's emotions and release them, particularly the negative ones. So we now have interpersonal psychology, emotional psychology, cognitive behavioral psychology. And even in cognitive behavioral psychology, they gave you homework, something the patient was supposed to do between 1 week sessions. And then came some really big changes. First, it was probably the effect, believe it or not, of New Age spirituality. But psychology discovered spirituality. And though at first it was kind of a secular kind of psychology, it soon couldn't avoid the fact that it had to do a lot with religion and with Christianity and with the spiritual life. The first psychologist to talk about this was Sigmund Freud. And he talked about, if you will, what we would call a spiritual experience. And he called it an oceanic experience. Now, being oceanic, it implies that since we live most of our life above sea level, it implies it's something low down, unconscious, and murky and scary. But it got renamed in about 1970 or a little earlier by Abraham Maslow. And he called it the peak experience. Look what a difference a name makes, from the oceanic experience to the peak experience. But for Maslow, the peak experience was strictly a kind of contact with the world as a whole without any content of religion, had no particular meaning except for this feeling itself. But spirituality came in to mainstream psychology, and with it, a lot of Christians could come into some of the psychological programs. And then a few years later, around the year 1990 to 2000, lo and behold, psychology expanded still further. And at that time, we got into, for the first time, what's called and known as forgiveness therapy. Imagine it took psychology all that time to discover forgiveness as an important psychological help and aid. But it happened. In 1990, roughly, Robert Enright and Everett Worthington, one a Catholic and Worthington a Protestant, both started publishing articles on forgiveness in psychology and in psychotherapy. And that program in each case has grown. And so now we have hundreds of psychologists who've written about the importance of forgiveness in psychotherapy. So again, we're expanding the understanding of the person as each of these new contributions comes in. Another major contribution, perhaps the last one, is more recent. It's come in the, let's say, from the year 2000 to now, or 2000 to 2010. And that's known as positive psychology, but it was really the focus on the virtues. Imagine a psychologist saying the first 100 years of psychology had been negative in that it only focused on our problems and the causes of our problems. And now a psychologist was going to focus on how we could live beyond our problems, how we could grow and flourish. Sigmund Freud was aware of this. He knew. He said psychoanalysis, that the best that it can do is to return the person to the normal level of human misery. Well, that's where most of us are anyway. So the question is, what do you do with the normal level of human misery? And here comes psychology finally discovering, after 2,500 years, discovering the virtues. And that's what positive psychology was about. And now the goal of psychology is not self-actualization, it's flourishing. It's flourishing with the virtues. And during all of this time, one other thing was going on. All kinds of psychologists were being trained as psychotherapists and as counselors. And from a Christian perspective, only because they were Christians, but not by psychology. And there were many, especially in the Protestant schools, there were many Christian psychologists that were actually being formed and graduated. And so years before DMU was on the scene, the profession of psychology was filling up with Christians of various kinds. And we owe those people, those Protestants, we owe them a big debt. Because now there are probably, I don't know, maybe 100,000 so-called Christians who are also psychotherapists in the country. And that means that the APA can't ignore us. And it doesn't. In fact, it published one of the first books on forgiveness. So that's important that the APA has seen that. Now we come to what I would call the most recent example of a contribution. And I think that's what's done here at DMU. Finally, after the person has been expanded to something much more reasonable, we come in with a meta model. I call it the meta model, not the CCMMP. We have a meta model, an overarching representation of the nature of the person, which will allow any existing theory that actually works and helps people to be incorporated, minus sometimes some of their basic assumptions, which aren't necessary for it to work. So now we have this overlying meta model understanding of the person in which the Christian faith is made clear. And instead of redemption being self-actualization, instead of redemption being even something like flourishing with the virtues, we can allow redemption to be, in fact, the acceptance of Jesus in our life as our Redeemer. And that's where So that's where psychology has finally come to. And it's actually a period, long years of, in my experience of 70 years, you don't know how narrow-minded a behaviorist can be. I really knew what they were like in the 1950s. Everything was learned by reinforcement, and we were all determined by those reinforcement schedules. But now, we are at this present situation, and what it means is that it's a time for us to be explicit about our faith as part of psychotherapy when that's appropriate. When we're not there to convert people, but we are there to show them the love of God in a way that will help them, and only to help them in a Christian way if they are in fact Christian and ask for it. But that's a new perspective, and it's a large perspective. In a certain sense, what is being done here at DMU is what Aquinas did to Greek philosophy. So we're trying to make modern secular psychology something that will no longer be hostile to the faith, and in fact can be used positively. So all of us are tiny little Thomas Aquinas doing that together. Now, of course, we know life right now, if we look around, we can be very discouraged. Somehow or other, everything seems to be going to hell, perhaps in a handbasket or perhaps in something else. But we see it, we know it. The most difficult thing that we will have in psychology as Christians, as Catholics, will be the confrontation with the contemporary understanding of sexuality. But I'm convinced that that conflict is necessary for us to develop not only our full understanding of sexuality, but to understand how to address it correctly, how to, in fact, provide the truth for the people who now in the secular world are not aware of it. But we have difficulties now, big difficulties about sexuality, maybe best shown by the transsexual movements and things of that kind. I won't offer any kind of particular solution to that here, but I would say this. In spite of all these difficulties, in spite of all your personal difficulties, much less the difficulties that come by being a psychologist or psychotherapist, we have to remember what our Lord said. Jesus said, "I have overcome the world. Be of good cheer." He said, "Don't fear. Be of good cheer." Thank you.